A quick warning. This story deals with bones, human and animal alike, and some of those animals are pets. This story from Canada was sent to me from a woman who claims to be a former photographer. She explains why she quit her passion and gave up her career in the following story. Please note, it is up to you to decide what you believe, but take stories like this with a grain of salt. It is titled simply, The Bone Sculptor. I make my living with a camera, usually in places people are trying to leave, funny enough. Think tundra in high summer, when the barren ground goes green and frantic for 6 weeks. Or old forest on the coast, light coming down through the canopy already half spent. I've endured more nights in a tent than in my own bed, and I prefer it that way. Or I used to. Let me tell you what I mean. So my photographs have run in 2 national magazines, and a calendar you may have bought at a gas station without noticing the name in the corner. It's part of my job to be an adventurous person, so I'm not nervous or too cowardly, I'd say. Being alone outside is the one thing I'm genuinely good at. Home, when I have one, is a town called Martin Lake. 1,900 people, a grocery store, a legion, a school that runs kindergarten to grade 12, all under one roof. In a town like this, the year's biggest story is a moose on the curling rink. But when a man named Don C. turned up dead, it broke something in that town, and I'm not sure it ever healed. Don went missing in autumn. That much made the news, such as our news is. A Facebook page and a notice on the co-op corkboard. Don C., whose full last name I won't share for the privacy of his family, aged 54, last seen leaving VSO. They found him 11 days later. That part never made the news. Not really. The page was never updated. The paragraph was never followed up with. If I were to search his full name today, I might find a missing man, missing in perpetuity, as if he'd simply walked off into the bush one fall and the story had politely declined to end. What actually happened to Don C., the way everyone here knows it, as told through gossip and rumors. Always secondhand, never first. I'll explain to you. I'm not going to pretend this is confirmed, but the same details arrived from too many directions to be nothing, and they were specific, dreadfully specific. Don C. had no exterior wound. That was the big commonality. There was not a mark on him you could point to and call a cause of death, and not enough blood around to matter. What there was instead, I'm sorry to put into your head, but it's been in mine ever since. Well, his bones were gone. But again, he was not opened up. They were not ripped out of him. They were drawn out, which was what one woman said to me. Drawn out through his mouth. Fished out through the mouth. Like when you're trying to pull the skeleton from a cooked trout if you were patient and didn't want to tear the meat. No incision, no way out of him but the one we're all born with. And they say the face he was wearing when they found him, it was like he witnessed hell himself before dying. Every version of the story agreed. Whatever Don C. saw at the end, he saw every bit of it, and it did not let him look away. This haunts me even still, for very good reason. It isn't only a man that I had nodded to at the pumps for 15 years, dying in a way that's unimaginable. It's that my town looked at it and decided, somewhere together without ever holding a meeting, I guess, that this simply could not be true, so it would not be spoken out loud. So Don C. stayed missing. It was easier to leave a hole where Don C. had been than to name the thing that filled it. By November, the town had gone quiet about it, the way small towns do, and I had work to do anyway. There's a stretch of muskeg and black spruce 40 minutes out the forestry road, where great gray owls hunt the edges in the early dark. The great gray is the kind of bird that can carry a career, They're enormous, and they do not care about you. You can stand in the open and watch one drop on a vole under 2 feet of snow, and it will look through you like you're just air. I set up on the tree line a little before 3, tripod sunk in the crust, long lens out. I'd been spying the same owl for the better part of an hour. That's most of my job. Not shooting much, just waiting for the bird to do something worth the frame. I was warm enough in my layers and excited, so patience came easy. I don't know how long he had been standing there before I finally noticed him. He was off to my right, northward, where the spruce thinned into open bog. Far off from me, a couple 100 meters at least, distance being hard to read over so much white. I first thought it was a stump or a burned snag, because it appeared too thin to be a person. That's what really struck me, how thin he was. Not lean like a tall man, thin like a man made wispy, like the closest you could get in real life to a stick figure of a man. He stood perfectly still, facing towards me, and once I understood he was a who and not a what, I couldn't unsee him, and I lost my focus on the owl. Now, you do see people out here every once in a while, like trappers or hunters. Sometimes you might see an idiot on a sled where no sledder should be. The typical and decent thing to do here is to signal to each other that you're normal, safe, not posing a danger. So I waited for that. The lift of a hand or a nod, anything like that. But nothing came. He simply stood dark and narrow, and the longer it ran, the worse that stillness got. A person at rest is never truly still, you know. Muscles get achy, breathing fluctuates. But he did none of that. He himself was like a photograph. After several minutes of this, I had to do something. I raised my arm and waved, that big whole arm wave, and I called out to him. Hello, just hello. I couldn't even be sure how far my voice traveled in that open space. But he did answer, neither with a wave nor a voice. Instead, he brought one arm straight up from the shoulder, stiff, all at once, like a child raising his hand in class. There was no motion in it, and his arm went straight up and stayed, one stiff arm raised to the sky. After a few moments, his arm dropped, and he turned in no hurry, I could tell, walking north into the spruce, until I could no longer see him in the trees. I stood there with my own hand still half lifted. I built a quick story about a shy man who didn't care for people in my head. Then I packed my gear, and I drove back to the cabin in the last of that light. This cabin was a rental I'd used before. Off-grid, like most things out here. It had a wood stove, a pile of firewood, propane lamp, and an outhouse a cold short walk from the door. It sat alone at the end of a spur off the forestry road, with nothing near it but bush and the lake, skinned with ice at the edges and black open water in the middle. I'd taken it for 2 weeks. I awoke a little after 2, needing to pee. That's the unglamorous part about cabin nights here. The outhouse is too far and too cold at that hour, so you step a few paces off the porch to the nearest tree, and you're quick about it. I'd done it 100 times by then. I didn't even take the lamp, just pulled on my boots and a coat over nothing, and crunched out to the big spruce at the clearing's edge. I heard footsteps when I was halfway through my business, and I couldn't stop. I don't think people mention that part about fear. That sometimes your faculties will stop. Other times they just won't. It really depends on what kind of person or victim you are. It tells you a lot about yourself. Those steps came from behind me, out of the open clearing, slow and even, heavy. There was a crunch, 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 straight on toward my back. They didn't slow. I stood facing that tree with everything in me locked, while a calm little voice in my head explained that I could not turn around just now, no matter how badly I wanted to, that I had to finish first, and that turning was not on the menu that my body was offering. A moose, I told myself. There are moose all through this country. They go where they please, they have no manners and answer to no one. A moose will wander into a clearing in the dark and stand near you and breathe, and you won't know this massive thing was right next to you until you find its tracks at dawn. It's a moose for sure, I made myself believe. I did not want to tell myself that I was a half-dressed woman pinned against a tree in the dark while someone walked up on her from behind. The steps stopped then, and I swear it was near enough I could have reached straight behind me and touched whoever made those steps. I never heard breathing. With a moose, you always do. They're big animals. They make big, slow breaths. But there was none of that, only the after feeling of weight, like I had been not alone until just now. I finished my business, now in a slight panic. Then, slowly, my hand shaking so bad I had to brace one flat on the bark, I turned around. There was nothing there. The clearing lay empty and blue under a new moon night. The snow between me and the cabin was unbroken, except for my own boot prints. There were no tracks anywhere that I could find besides my own. Whatever had walked up behind me, it walked without leaving a mark. Or it had never been there at all. I stood there staring at that unbroken white, starting to pray that it really was just a moose. I went back across the clearing fast, watching the trees, and I was nearly to the steps before I saw the shape on the porch. It was small, whatever it was, right at the foot of the door, placed with care apparently. In the dark and at that angle, it refused to be anything to my eyes. Was it a package? I thought, stupidly, as if someone might deliver something to this end of the road, all the way out in the middle of nowhere. I came up the steps and crouched over it. Eventually, my eyes adjusted, and I could tell what it was. When it finally revealed itself to me, I was shocked. It was a hare, a snowshoe hare in its winter white. Something had killed it, skinned part of it, and done other things to it, then stood it up, propping it on its hind legs against the door, jaw pinned somehow so it gaped. The small body opened and rebuilt into a shape that wasn't a hare at all anymore, but the most messed up little mockery of one. A hare made into a monster out of its body. One forelimb had been fixed, pointing straight up from the shoulder, stiff and held there, as if to say hello. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the cot, and I watched. I had the lamp turned all the way up, and a knife in my hand that I had no idea if I could use when the moment struck. I watched the door until sunup. Owen T. is a conservation officer and the nearest thing I have to a real friend in Martin Lake. We've known each other 20 years. He's the one who first walked me into the owl ground, back before I knew what I was doing with the camera. He's spent 2 decades being completely unsurprised by whatever the bush can throw at him. I drove in the moment the hour was halfway decent, and I turned up at his office with the hare in a contractor bag in the bed of the truck. Some part of me needed a person with a badge to look at it, to confirm it was a thing that actually happened in this world. He studied it a long time, but never touched it. Owen doesn't rattle, but he went a particular kind of still when he saw it. When he finally spoke, he didn't start with the bag. "Did you see anybody out there?" he asked. I did tell him about the figure at the bog, and the thinness of the man, the way his arm went straight up and the weirdest hello I'd ever seen. He let me get all the way through without once interrupting, which actually isn't like him, and at the end he asked me to describe the arm again, so I did. He nodded slowly down at the bag, as if those two things had just shaken hands in front of us. "I don't want you out there alone right now," he said. "That's basically an order. Not the cabin, not the back roads, not the owl ground. Not until we know what this is." "God, Owen, do you think it's the same person?" I asked. That question had been nagging at me the whole drive. Whether whoever did that to a hair on my doorstep might have been the one who had done that to Dawn. He interrupted me this time. "I don't know," Owen said. "Honestly, I don't. I don't want to say something I'm not even sure of. That's just going to keep you up at night." He drew the bag shut and knotted it himself, carefully, as if he might break the thing inside, which was already beyond broken. No real reason to think so anyway. People do ugly things, and most of them never escalate past ugly. But I'd be lying if I said I liked the timing. He looked at me straight. "Stay in town a few days. Stay at the house with Rinna and the kids if you have to. Just not out there. Promise me that." I promised him, and I meant it. He rubbed his hand down his face, then told me the rest. He'd phoned it to the detachment, he said, and that I should know what that was worth. The nearest RCMP was 2 hours of bad road off in Thompson, 3 positions short and buried in backlog, and a dead hare and a man I couldn't describe past then. That wasn't going to pull anyone off, whatever they were already behind on. He would ride it up, then he'd swing by the cabin when his rounds carried him near it. But Owen checked hunting tags and winched trucks out of ditches for a living. If this turned into the thing neither of us wanted it to, he was not the person to call, sadly. The break-ins started that same week, and at first, no one tied them to anything. They were too strange to fit any ordinary story. Someone got into the place belonging to the Lavois. The owner, Marie, was away at her sister's, and this intruder took exactly one thing: the urn off the mantel. You'd think an intruder would go for the TV or the cash she left in the kitchen drawer, but no. Whoever it was, they took her husband, 3 years gone, in a brass vase, carrying him off into the night. They left behind everything a thief would want, and took the one object only a certain kind of person would. 2 nights later, it was the Hattons, and what went missing there was Boomer, their old shepherd, dead 9 years and stuffed by a taxidermist down in the city because they hadn't been able to put him in the ground. He'd stood in their kitchen the whole time, a little moth-worn. One morning he was gone, and a back window stood open to the cold. With towns like these, you can feel their emotion, the change in it, sort of like the weather changing. By that Friday, no one was saying prowler or even psycho. They'd dropped into something quieter and worse. The understanding that whoever this was did not want what the living kept. He wanted the dead. Ashes, a stuffed dog, a hare made into a gargoyle placed on a stranger's door. And a thought sat under all of it, too awful to say in the co-op lineup. The same appetite had come for Dawn C. first. But why, when Dawn had been alive? I stayed in town, keeping my promise to Owen, not yet heading back out. One day I got a call. I get calls sometimes. There's an address and a number on my website for prints and licensing, and every now and then a stranger might use it to tell me a photo of mine meant something to them. That's the best part of this work, and it's also the rarest. When the phone rang with a number I didn't know, and a young man's voice asked, slightly breathless, if he was speaking to me by name, I assumed that's what this was. He was a fan. He said so straight off, and he had the receipts for it. He named a shot of mine from years back, a willow ptarmigan hunkered in a spring storm that I had always been quietly proud of, but almost nobody ever mentions it. He talked fast, doubling back over his own sentences, apologizing for bothering me, but then not stopping. It was charming mostly, and a little lonely. That kind of call you give a few extra minutes, because the person plainly needs them more than you need the time back. He asked what my favorite bird was. I get that one constantly, and I never have a good answer. So I gave the answer I always give, that it depends on the day and the light. He laughed as though I'd said something marvelous. Then he asked where I like to shoot. I said vaguely around north of town, the usual spots. But then his voice shifted, dropping into something more careful. He said he hoped I was staying safe with everything going on up there. He'd heard about it, the man who went missing and the break-ins. Terrible, he said. You don't expect it from a place like that. He said it kindly, and it ought to have landed as kindness. But it didn't, because I had never told him where up there was, and the break-ins hadn't reached any news that I knew of. I told him that I was being careful. Good, he said, good. He told me to take care of myself, and he thanked me one more time and was gone. For a moment I thought, very strange. But then I decided he was a sweet, overly online young guy. Maybe he had read the local pages too closely, more closely than I did. I lasted 9 days in town. Sure, I think of myself as a sensible woman, and I know I was warned off by a man with a badge. I was even sleeping poorly on a friend's couch, and I wouldn't load the truck and drive back to a cabin at the end of a spur road in the dark of the year. But my work does not wait for the world to be safe, and the snow was just right. I had a deadline too. 9 days of fear had soured into stubbornness and anxiousness. While Owen was away on a call-out in the next district, I didn't tell him that I was going. The forecast said flurries. Up here, that word will cover almost anything. By the time I'd unloaded and gotten the stove drawing, the flurries had become the real article, and within the hour the real article had become a wall. Wind off the lake driving snow flat across the clearing until the tree line went out like someone had wiped it off the glass. There would be no shooting for me. There was barely a question of reaching the outhouse. So I had to do the indoor version of cabin life, which I despise, and which I'll spare you most of, except to say that when you can't get to an outhouse in a whiteout, you make do. And making do means a pan kept by the door and a few wretched inches of open window, whenever the need outgrows what a pan can dignify, and the cold keeps coming through any gap. I'm a grown professional, and I spent that evening managing my own body with a roasting pan and apologizing to myself. It's the least frightening thing in this story, but I'm saying it here so you know that I was alone and stuck. For dinner, I had tuna. I had a sleeve and a half of soda crackers. I hadn't done a proper grocery run, because I wasn't even sure if I was coming back out until last minute. So supper was tuna on crackers eaten standing over the stove. The radio promised the system would push through overnight and ease by morning, and I believed it, and I hoped it to be true. In the middle of the night, the porch woke me. I'd gone down in my clothes on the cot by the stove with the lamp turned low. The first thing was the quiet. The wind had died down, the storm had faded to silence, and within that silence I heard something on the porch. It's an old porch. Those boards are loud, creaking constantly underfoot, and across 2 weeks I've basically memorized each one's specific sound. What I was hearing now was weight crossing them, board by board, slowly, moving from the far end toward the door. And I knew for certain that this was not wind. Wind doesn't take steps 1 foot at a time. Someone was out there, walking the length of the porch, and taking their time to do so. I lay on the cot with my eyes open in the dark, not moving, only listening. The steps reached the door and stopped. I heard the handle beginning to move, the dry little rattle of the latch, and the soft press of someone testing whether the door would give. It held. I'd locked it at dusk, out of habit, which I'd never once needed until apparently now. The handle eased back. There was a pause, a long one. Whoever was out there was thinking of what to do next. But then the boards spoke again in reverse. The far end now, still slowly. Then it stopped. The quiet came back, and everything settled down. I didn't go back to sleep right off. After a while, long enough that the fear had worn down to a dull watchfulness, I got up and went to the door, checking it with my own hand. Locked, handle firm. I stood a moment, with my palm flat against the cold wood. The solidity of it calmed me, and in the end, that talked me back down. I went over to the cot, and I went to sleep. I woke up in the early morning light to find that I'd been outlined in bone. They lay around me on the floor in a careful border, following the shape of the cot and of me on it, near but never touching. These were bird bones, small, pale bird bones, scores of them, ribs and the long hollow wing bones and little jointed feet, laid out carefully into a line that ran from beside my pillow, down one side, around my feet, and back up the other. A thin, pale outline of a sleeping woman drawn in the leavings of birds. I lay inside it. I could barely breathe. Someone had knelt over me in the night for what had to be a very long time, close enough to touch me, and they worked their way around the whole edge of my sleeping body, then left. When I looked up, the door was shut. I made myself rise, stepping over the bones, crossing over to the door. The lock was still thrown, just as I'd left it, locked. I almost laughed, some cracked little sound, because it made no sense. A locked door is locked, and yet these bones were on the inside of this cabin with me. To prove the lock to myself one more time, I took the handle and gave a very hard, frustrated pull, and the whole door swung loose toward me, off the frame. It came away at the hinges, both of them. The screws sat in their holes with nothing behind them, the wood gone soft and chewed through, and the bolt I'd taken such comfort in held fast in its plate, while the door it was set into simply lifted aside, like a lid off a pot. It had not been truly locked. All this time I was sleeping behind an open door. That bolt was nothing more than an ornament. Anyone who knew, anyone who had stood out there in the dark testing the handle and feeling it hold, then walking away, they knew the whole time that the door would open to a pull, or for them on the outside, a push. Whoever that was the night before, they had come back. I stood in that open frame with the dead door in my hands, and the cold pouring in across my bones, as well as the bird bones. And out beyond the steps, the new snow lay smooth and unmarked all the way to the tree line. Not a single track anywhere to be found. Impossibly clean. Leaving was the sane thing to do. When someone breaks in and outlines your sleeping body with bird bones, you pack the truck and you drive south. Let the cabin keep its winter to itself. But what I did instead was get angry. I didn't get the hot kind of angry, but the cold kind, for an organized person. For 2 months I'd been sick over a dead man the whole town had agreed to keep calling missing, over a truth nobody would put on paper. And here the truth was walking right to my porch in the dark, kneeling over me, leaving me little treats. If I ran, it all stayed a rumor, something only talked about in kitchens or in alleyways. But I had the one tool on earth for turning a rumor into a fact, sitting on the table in a padded case. The very thing I made my career around. A camera. So I stayed. Now, you don't find a great gray owl by wandering around and hoping you'll see one. You learn its edges, its habitats, its habits, the lines it keeps. Whatever was using the dark around that cabin had lines and habits to keep. The first clue came in the form of an owl. The specific owl I'd been watching had hunted the same bog margin, but now it would no longer go near a whole arm of country to the northeast, giving that region a wide berth. I'd have done the same if I were still listening to the older part of myself. On the second afternoon, the wind out of that arm carried something. The reek of low tide, but with the scent of rot. My plan was to photograph whatever was making that smell and bring the picture to Owen. Evidence. If I had some evidence, this whole mess would be over, or rather it would be solved. I didn't tell Owen I was going, though. He'd have told me to stay put, and I didn't want to hear that. It was cold enough that the snow squeaked under my boots. The sky was clear and there was no wind. A morning I would normally have been happy to be out in. I left the truck at the cabin and walked on. There was no road where I was going, and the sound of a snowmobile carries for miles out there. I wanted to come up on this quietly. The camera hung across my chest, and I kept my hands in my pockets. Every few minutes I patted the side pocket to feel the spare battery, to make sure it was still there. My breath was freezing on my scarf, then on my eyelashes. I kept having to wipe them clear. The cold was painful that morning. I was wearing basically everything that I'd packed, down to the heavy mitts I saved for serious weather, and I was still freezing before I'd gone very far. I'd been moving slow, stopping every minute to listen. Stopping at all lets the cold in. After about 20 minutes, I stopped recognizing anything around me. I crossed a frozen creek into some spruce so thick I had to turn sideways to push through, and the old snow under the trees was packed hard. There was no trail here, but someone had been coming through here. Branches bent aside instead of snapped. However, there were no footprints. Somebody had been through here, back and forth. That alone creeped me out, and I kept walking. It was slow. The path wandered around deadfall and around the thicker stands of spruce. Twice it forked, and I had to guess which way to go. At each fork I snapped a branch so I could find my way out, though I wasn't sure if I'd be making it out the same way I came, if at all. I'd been walking close to an hour when the trees finally began to thin. That smell got so much worse the deeper I went, until I was breathing through my mouth to keep myself from gagging. A few times I stopped, thinking about turning back, wondering if this was worth it, but I chose to continue on. I've wondered since then why I did, and I think the answer is and was that I wanted to see it. I mean, looking at what other people won't is what I do for a living, and that pull was stronger than any fear I had. The spruce opened up. There was a clearing back there I'd never known about, small with the sun coming in sideways across the snow, and in the middle of it stood something. I stopped at the trees, and for a moment I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a twisted dead tree? A big leaning snag? Nothing else out here gets that tall. When the full picture clicked in my head, my stomach dropped. It was built out of bone, whatever it was. It stood twice my height and ran as wide as my small cabin. All of it was bone, and someone had built it. The long bones, moose and caribou by the look of them, stood up out of the snow like posts, braced at the base to hold their places. Smaller bones filled the rows between. Ribs slotted into ribs. Shoulder blades lay over one another like roof shingles. The whole of it was lashed tight with wire and sinew and strips of dried hide. Careful work this was. Whoever made it knew what they were doing and took all the time they needed. There were also skulls in it, placed firmly in the structure, wherever the curve of one could take more weight. The big antlered ones rode near the top, dog and wolf skulls set lower. Down in the gaps were smaller skulls than those, more than I could count. Foxes and hares and marten, and others I didn't recognize. Most of them faced the same way I was facing. Someone had sorted these bones and set them in this place like this, on purpose. The long ones carried the weight, and the flat ones closed it over, and it stood under its own load. Dry bone doesn't like to do that. Where two pieces met and the joint was weak, it had been bound and bound again with wire until it held. That's the kind of thing you don't figure out on the first try. You build it, watch it come down, and build again, and it can take years. Whoever made this had been coming out here for years, to a place where nobody ever comes. Off to one side, on a square canvas in the snow, lay a set of tools. Ordinary tools. A hand drill, pliers, a coil, wire cutters. The snow around the base was packed tightly, clearly from being treaded over for a long time, and yet still no signs of footprints. This was a work site, kept very well ordered. Everything was laid out and ready for the next time he came. This sculpture, it leaned a little toward the east, toward the rising sun. Maybe it was aimed at something, but what? I couldn't tell. But it was obvious to me that there was some sort of order to it, a purpose to it, and that was the worst part. If it was just a heap of bones, that's creepy, but I could walk away from it knowing it was a heap of bones. This was something thought through, meticulous and planned, and it had a purpose, one that I did not get to know. I hated that thought while standing there right in the middle of it. I noticed the bone low down had gone gray and chalky, soft at the edges. Higher up it was paler and newer. It had been growing for quite some time. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound, but the clearing did not feel empty. Have you ever been to a place where everything felt wrong, like the vacant old home to someone who had offed themselves inside? It felt like that, a place where something bad had happened, or was going to. I did not want to step closer to it, and I feared turning my back to it too, as if it would come alive and pull me into it to become another piece. So I stayed at the edge of the trees and kept looking, kept seeing more of it when I wanted more than anything to see less. Some of those bones were not animal bones. I think deep down we can all tell a human bone when we see one. It gives you a chill up your spine when you stumble upon one where it shouldn't be. And I could see clearly there were bones of someone here that the town kept calling missing. Someone who was not just missing. Among the skulls at the bottom was a human-shaped skull. A single one. Don C's skull. Without getting closer, I walked sideways, flanking the structure, to get a better look at this human-shaped skull. And how I wish I never had. As I walked to see the other side, more human skulls revealed themselves. At least a dozen. I could barely breathe. I hoped these were taken from a graveyard, but there had been no reported grave robbings. Then I wondered, how long have the disappearances been happening? Was Dawn's the only one? The most recent, the most dramatic one? I recalled then a couple of stories from the town. Stories that weren't the truth, apparently. A decade ago, there was a trapper, a man who walked out on his marriage. People said he fled town, and he was never seen again. There was a teenager everyone figured had hitched south and never called home, looking for a better life or excitement. also never seen again. The type of quote-unquote disappearances that wouldn't be news stories or overly dramatic gossip for a long time. Not like Dawn's murder. But standing there, looking at these skulls, I wondered how many of these stories ended here. Lower down, around chest height, one bird had been worked in more carefully than anything else around it. A small willow ptarmigan, bones opened out into a spread wing pose, a position it never would have been in while alive. I knew that bird. I had photographed one like it years earlier in a spring storm. Then I remembered the phone call with that stranger, the fan, the one who brought up that exact picture, asking me what my favorite bird was, laughing at me when I wouldn't say for sure. No, he never needed me to answer. He already had the answer. And standing there, I finally understood what that monstrous form of a hair on my porch had been, as well as the bones around me that I woke to. Gifts. They'd been gifts the entire time, not threats or warnings. If someone would kill to take bones from people and animals, he could have killed me in the night while I slept, but he did not. Instead, he left trinkets for me. This psychopath, he was an artist showing his work to the one person he wanted to see it. And as I kept walking around the structure, I saw that he was on the far side of it. I hadn't seen him at first. He was the same pale color as the bones, and just as still. I was hoping it was just another structure. But this was a man. He knelt at the base with his back to me, his hands busy with something, and his shoulders shifting around, definitely working on something that I couldn't see. He had the dog on his back, the Hatton's old shepherd, the stuffed one that someone had taken, draped over his shoulders and down his spine, wearing it like a hide, its dried face resting against the back of his skull, and its glass eyes pointing straight at me. Below that dog, he wore skins of other animals, sewn into a long coat. There were feathers threaded into the seams. When he moved, the edges of him stirred. I should have run while his back was turned, but I didn't. I stood there with my camera, and neither my legs nor my hands would move. "You came," he said. He did not turn around. It was the voice from the phone, the same young-sounding man who had gushed about my pictures, slower now, calmer, and sounding more aged than I thought before. He also sounded glad, and that scared the hell out of me. This psycho was happy that I'd come. "I hoped you would," he said. He kept messing with something in his hands, facing the bones. "I left that little one for you. The hair. I wasn't sure it was clear enough. I'm not good at the small ones, you see." He stopped a second. "No, you're good at the small ones. That's how I knew it was you. You notice things. Everyone else walks past things, but you stop and you look, and you get other people to look too. I've been watching what you look at for a long time." He lifted a hand, and I watched it move over the bones, fitting a new piece in or testing it. A sick thought went through me, that he was adding to it even now, with me standing right there, like I'd walked in on him at a hobby, and he wanted to finish one last stitch before he set it down. The dog's dead face watched me the whole time over his shoulder. I have no idea how long it went on, but it felt very, very long. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. My mouth was incredibly dry, and I could feel my heart in my throat. My truck was probably an hour behind me now, through brush that I'd never retrace if I ran, and he was between me and the only way I knew back. Eventually, he spoke again. "I came, and I looked at you, too, while you were sleeping." He said it gently. "I didn't touch you. I would never touch you. I only wanted to see you the way you see your birds. So I put you in it for a little while to see how you looked." I thought of the bird bones around me and on the cabin floor, close to my body but never touching me. At the time, I thought it was someone trying to scare me. Now I understood. He'd done to me exactly what I do with my camera, arranging me, stepping back, and taking a look, making up his mind about the arrangement. And when I realized what he meant, I lost my breath again. He had decided I belonged in the thing he was building. He turned around. His face was a mix of young, yet wise beyond his years, while also looking so ordinary. If I had passed him on the street, I would not give him a second look. Maybe I already had. But there was something wrong under his face that I felt more than I saw. He looked very happy to see me. He raised one arm straight up from the shoulder, all at once, stiff, and held it there. That same wave from the bog. Then he lowered it, and the gladness in his face softened into something more like sorrow. "You've seen it now. I'm glad. And I'm sorry." He looked up the height of it. "It can't stay now that someone's seen it. And it's not finished. Not even close. I'll have to take it apart and start over somewhere else. Don't worry. I've done it all before." He looked back at me. "But you have seen it, and it still needs a lot." He sounded shy all of a sudden, like he was working up to asking for a favor. "It needs a lot that's hard to get." His eyes went over me once, head to foot, taking stock of what I was made of, what might be useful. Was he going to do to me then that he had done to Don C? The thing that made no wound and left him with no bones. "It doesn't hurt the way you think it might," he said. "I'm very good with the big ones." This man was telling me that he was going to kill me, and he said it so gently, as if he was doing me a kindness. He took an easy step towards me, still talking, though by then I'd stopped hearing the words. My hands worked again, and I gripped the camera. That's the only thing that got me out. This had nothing to do with courage. My hands always go to my camera when the rest of me locks up. The camera provides a very big flash when I set the flash on, and with the low light under these trees, it would throw a hard wall of pure white. When he stepped toward me, I raised the camera and fired it into his face from a few feet away. Everything went white for a second, and in that second I saw two things. The first was the full structure, completely lit. It was further along than I'd let myself believe, looking nearly done. The second was him. His face did not react to the light whatsoever. His eyes stayed open. Pupils did not change. He didn't flinch or squint or turn away. He stood full in the white with his eyes open and flat, shining with that same dull flatness as the glass eyes on the dog he wore. And there was nothing inside, just the visage of a person, with nothing really going on within them. The flash died, the dark slammed down twice as deep, and by then I was running. I ran into multiple trees. The flash had blinded me more than it did to him. A massive color-changing blot floated over everything I looked at. I fell, got up, fell again, taking branches across the face. A branch opened a cut over my eyebrow, and the blood ran into my eye, freezing on my cheek. I went on with one eye shut, swiping at it, falling and getting up again. The whole time I braced for his hand on my shoulder, but that feeling never came. Instead, behind me, under the sound of my own breathing, was a sound I will never unhear. Bone knocking against bone. He did not decide to pursue me. Instead, he had turned around and began to take apart his structure. The moment I was gone, he began bringing it all down. Saving it mattered to him more than I did. Saving his bones so he could start again. He let me run, worried more about his work. I was worth less to him than a stack of bones, and I was all the more grateful for that. I don't remember the creek or most of the way back. Somehow I found my broken branches, or maybe I got lucky, and I came out at the cabin with my face cut up and my lungs ablaze. My hands were shaking too bad to do much with them, but I managed to get the truck started. Then I drove. I took the forestry road too fast in the dark, sliding through 2 bends, and I didn't lift off the gas. It would be an hour to town, and most of that time I lost. The memory I do have of that drive is of my hands shaking badly and the heater roaring, the dome light on and burning the whole way. Leaving it on was probably stupid. It turned the windshield into a mirror and hid everything outside. But I left it on anyway. I could not, after that, be alone in the dark inside that cab. Thank God Owen got back that night. He found me waiting on his step. I must have looked like something out of the bush myself, with blood dried on my face, one of my mittens gone, shaking. He didn't ask a single question. He quickly took me inside and set me down in his kitchen, putting a blanket over me. He waited for me to calm down, and eventually I did. The story came out of me with no order to it at all. The poor guy. He was basically hearing nonsense for at least 15 minutes. But when I finally put it together for him, calmly and more slowly, he believed me. I'll be grateful that he did for the rest of my life, but I'm sad to say that it didn't come to much. You'll soon understand why. The next morning, 2 of us drove back out with 2 other officers, a GPS as well, and my best guess at the route to the structure. Finding that dreadful clearing took most of the day. We found it. I was sure it was the spot. But the clearing was empty, and there wasn't a single footprint in the snow that wasn't mine. There were, however, holes in the ground where heavy things had been sunk and pulled back out, and the smell was still there. One of the younger officers asked what it was, but no one had an answer. No bone or wire or skulls remained. That freak had carried every piece of it off, while I sat shaking in my truck. Carried it all off to somewhere in the bush, which itself loses things for a living. I watched the officers, pacing the edge of the hole-filled snow, studying it. They were very obviously confused as to how to write this up in a report. I thought I had one picture to give them, but the night before, when I was at Owen's, we looked at the photo together. Solid white. The flash had been too close, too bright. The canopy, I guess, was too low, causing it to reflect too harshly. The worst thing, the worst person I'd ever seen in my life, came out as a blank white rectangle. I had no evidence, just my word and the holes in the snow. I left Martin Lake that spring. I'd lived there 11 years, and I packed up in about a week. Rumors, of course, sprouted. That I'd been a victim of one of the break-ins. That I had nerves about what was going on. No one judged me. Martin Lake had become a very creepy place for everyone with what was going on. After I left, I sold most of my gear. To a kid in Prince George, in fact, for less than half of what it's all worth. I live in a more urban town now. I could live without seeing or being too close to the trees again for at least the next half of my remaining life. These days, I sleep with the lights on, and I make sure my windows and doors lock and actually work correctly. As far as I know, that man was never caught. They never figured out how he pulled the bones from a man without leaving a wound on the outside. And I never personally could come up with an explanation as to how this man left no footprints anywhere he went. One day I'm going to be 60 years old, and I'll have finally convinced myself that the man was never real at all. I've always found taxidermy to be creepy. If you handed me a rabbit taxidermy made into a necromorph, I probably would leave town too, but much sooner than she did. Hold on tight to your bones, everyone. You never know when the stranger you just met is a fan of your bones and might be planning to take them. Good night. Thank you for listening to this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. You can send me your scary work-related stories at eeriecast.com/submit. And you can support this show, unlock ad-free episodes, and bonus stories by becoming a member over at erie.fm. Thank you. Till next time, everyone, I'll be clocking out. But don't worry, I've got to clock back in real soon.